Hello, everyone. I think let's kick things off. And we're delighted to welcome you to this webinar, part of our Low Carbon Futures series. It's an understatement to say that the past year has been turbulent for the European gas market. Over the next 18 months, Europe's now facing its first 2 winters without large volumes of Russian gas. How's it set right now to face that challenge? We're excited to share our latest views with you on the outlook for European gas security of supply for the year to come. I'm Mark Turner, so a partner in Baringa's energy team, and I'm going to be helping to lead today's session. And I'm pleased to say that we have 3 expert speakers with us today to guide us through this topic. Pete Thompson leads our natural gas and LNG commercial and market advisory team. Pete's got more than 15 years experience working all along the gas value chain globally. We then have Farah Danesh, who's an expert in simulation and optimization modeling. Farah's leading our global gas market model development and the development of our supply demand outlook for gas. We also have Giovanni Bettinelli, an expert in gas market analysis and modeling as well. And Giovanni's helping to lead our gas market and commercial advisory work and activities. So welcome to all 3 of our speakers. And let us maybe take a look at the agenda then for today's session. We're going to kick off, and I'll hand over in a second to Farah, who's going to take us through the supply shortfall. So what is the situation around the supply of gas and the volumes of those? I'll then hand over to Giovanni, who will take us through some of the dynamics which are shaping the supply-demand balance for the coming year. And then Pete is going to help us draw that together into the longer-term implications and the outlook for gas security of supply overall. We will have some time at the end for Q&A, so please do use the chat box in Teams to post questions. Feel free to post those as we go along in the session. We're going to run through the presentation first, and then we will run into Q&A at the end. But please do feel free to post questions as we go along through the session. So I think without further ado, let me hand over to Farah, first of all, who is going to kick us off with today's presentation.
Thank you, Mark. If we move to the first slide, so in this slide, I'm going to talk about what happened generally for gas supply to Europe in 2022, this year. If you look at the plot, the stacked bar chart on the left side, you see this is showing the gas and LNG flow, monthly flow to Europe from beginning of this year to November this year. And on top of that, the blue line shows the monthly average flow in 2021 to Europe. By comparing the stacked bar chart and the line on top of that, you see we are seeing gradual drop in total gas supply, gas and LNG supply to Europe, and that is mainly because of lower supply from Russia. If you look at the pink bar at the bottom of the bar chart, this is showing the supply from Russia, starting from 8 to 10 BCM in January, February, March this year, and gradually dropping down to about 2 BCM per month recently. We replaced a big part of that shortfall by increase in LNG supply in Europe, a bit higher production from North Sea, about 14%, about 5% higher North Sea production, but indigenous production was lower this year, about 14% compared to last year. Moving to the chart on the right-hand side, this is showing how this shortfall in Russian supply have been replaced this year. A big part of it has been through more LNG flow to Europe. LNG flow to Europe has been more than 70% higher this year compared to last year. A lower demand in Asia helped Europe redirect LNG to Europe because of many reasons. In China, for instance, zero COVID policy led to lower economic activities and reduced demand. Also, in other markets that they couldn't afford LNG because of very high prices, their demand reduced a lot, and this helped Europe secure more LNG and flow it to the continent. We had a bit higher Russian pipeline flow, for instance, from Azerbaijan, but again, a bit part of that has been from demand reduction. So this plot is showing what happened in the last 30 days, but generally a big part of this demand reduction happened already in summer. With very high gas prices, we saw a demand reduction in industries. Also, wherever possible, there have been fuel switches to coal and other fuels, especially for electricity generation. And more recently, probably before in autumn, basically, we had lower residential gas consumption because of higher than average temperature and milder weather that I think it's going to change in the next couple of weeks. But that basically reduced gas demand a lot. And you can see the percentages of each of these LNG and demand reduction, how they made up this shortfall of gas, basically. So with this showing what happened in this year, I'll move to next slide, where we are going to see what we are possibly going to see in the next year in gas supply. So again, in the left column, you can see what's the expected next year shortfall compared to pre-crisis levels. So these numbers are comparing what is going to happen next year compared to 2021. So we are expecting to have decreased indigenous production compared to this year compared to 2021 because of lower Dutch production and totally indigenous production. Again, we are going to experience the similar amount of reduction in Russian flow as much as we experienced in 2022 this year. But on top of that, we have additional reduction from Russia. As I explained in previous slide, we started this year with about 8 to 10 BCM monthly flow from Russia. But this year, if the current flows continue to flow for the whole 2023, we are going to see further reduction in Russian flow. So that's going to add up to the reduction we already experienced this year. Whether this current flow is going to continue or not, that's a big question. So if we experience even lower flows, this amount of additional reduction is going to be even higher. On the right column, you see how this total shortfall next year could be replaced by different sources. A part of it is, again, like this year, from other pipeline imports. If the flow is the same in next year, is going to be the same as this year. Another big part of it is, again, LNG import that played a big role this year to replace a big part of Russian gas flow. If we assume that the same volumes are available again this year, that's going to replace a big part of it. But that's, again, a big question if this LNG flexible volumes of LNG, flexible LNG in global market is still available next year or not. If there is more LNG available, we can flow more. If less, it's going to be difficult to say this much is going to be available or not. On top of that is going to be, again, demand reduction, as we saw in 2020 this year. But by comparing the two, like the height of these columns, you see that we may need to reduce demand even further. It again also depends on the weather situation, how much gas we're going to use this winter, and also depends a lot on the flexible LNG available in the global market. And with the more capacity, import capacity in Europe, if that LNG, flexible LNG is available, we will be able to import more LNG. If we go to the next slide. Thank you. So this is a heat map showing the level of demand disruption in the next 3 years. Our global gas model enables us to look at supply-demand balance in a more granular way, to be able to see how countries differ in the level of disruption they may experience and how this disruption evolves over time. There are two factors that shape this disruption. First, as you can guess, it's about the level of supply available to each of these countries on the columns. And this supply depends on their storage capacity, the level of gas in the storage, pipeline and LNG import, as well as indigenous production. And comparing that supply to their demand, and also on top of that, how flexible their demand is to the gas supply. The more flexible their demand is, they will experience less disruption. So both of these factors shape this index that we're showing in terms of demand disruption. For all of the countries, you can see that the situation is getting better gradually in 2025. So lower disruption is green and higher disruption is red. One of the main reasons is that at global level, more LNG is going to be available from 2025 onward, and it helps Europe secure more LNG in the continent. But in the short term, if you look at summer next year, for instance, you see that the situation isn't getting necessarily much better in all countries. And it's because basically we will be using the gas we have in storage. The storage level is very high at the moment, but in winter, depending again on the weather, we will be using that gas we have in storage, and we are not able to replenish it very quickly as we used to do in previous years by Russian gas. So basically, it again depends on LNG flow to Europe as well. And this is going to lead to this still a bit red colors in summer next year. I think with this, I will hand it over to Giovanni to talk through the supply-demand balance and dynamics in Europe.
Thank you, Farah. If we move to the next slide, please. So having looked at the situation so far and the potential supply gap in 2023, we're going to dive into a bit more depth into the dynamics that we expect will be shaping exactly the size of this supply gap for Europe. We will look at how there is still a lot of uncertainty as to how exactly the market will evolve in 2023, and there's still a lot of potential scenarios potentially at play. So if we start first with really what has been shaping the bulk of the crisis so far for Europe, which is the evolution of Russian flows. As Farah has mentioned earlier, we're still getting about the equivalent of 20 to 25 BCM per year from Russia. This is coming via Ukraine, then onwards to Hungary and Slovakia, via Turkey to Bulgaria, Serbia, and again Hungary. And there is still a concrete possibility that Russian flows to Europe will be further reduced. It is especially a concrete possibility at the moment because Russia has threatened repeatedly to curtail further supply in response of the proposed TTF price cap, which is currently under discussion. And a further reduction in Russian supply will obviously add potentially 20 more BCM to that supply gap, which we've already talked is going to be higher in 2023 than 2022. And this will have specifically a concrete and direct impact in those countries that are still reliant on the continuation of Russian supply, especially those countries in Southeastern Europe, which are visualized here in the map that we have here, which shows on a darker red color the countries that are going to suffer most from a complete interruption of Russian supply. And as I said, there's still a lot of uncertainty as to how exactly this will evolve. It will depend on the ongoing geopolitical dynamics, but it remains a concrete risk that we will see even lower Russian supply to Europe in 2023, and that risk probably is maybe especially high in Q1 2023 because of the potential response to the proposed price cap. If we go on to the next slide, we can then look at another dynamic that is going to play a key role in shaping the evolution of the crisis for Europe over the next 12 to 18 months, and that is the level of storage and the rate of withdrawals from storage. As we alluded earlier, we are currently at record level storage levels, and Europe has done very well in 2022 in filling the storage capacity almost to capacity. And this is shown here on the chart on the left by showing how much higher we are at the moment compared to the average of the previous years. And this is then translated to the chart on the right, where we see that the risk of storage depletion by the end of the 22-23 winter is currently relatively low. And this is mainly due to two factors, as we've just discussed, the fact that we are at very, very high storage levels above than what we've seen in previous years, and the fact that demand has in recent weeks, in the last couple of months, been lowered by relatively mild weather, and we are still at present at withdrawals that are in line, if not lower than historical averages. And at the moment, if we assume that things continue at this rate, the risk is relatively low for most European countries, but this situation will be evolving rapidly throughout the rest of the winter, and a period of accelerated withdrawals from storage will change this picture very quickly, and therefore it will be very important in order to assess the potential risk to monitor the level of storage withdrawals, as this potentially can push policymakers and regulators to, for example, curtail supply to low priority users if there is a perceived risk of potential storage depletion. Again, as we have alluded earlier, then the position that storage will be left at the end of the winter will shape the dynamics for the rest of the 2023, as we will continue to have potentially high levels of demand destruction and a maximization of all other possible import routes to ensure that there is sufficient storage ahead of the 23-24 winter. And the success of Europe in refilling storage throughout 2023 will then play a key role in shaping the dynamics for the following winter. And therefore, monitoring exactly the dynamics of storage, and especially the different dynamics by country and the different responses to these dynamics by country will be very important in assessing future risks. Moving on to the next slide, we can look at probably the main dynamic that will shape the rate of storage withdrawals, especially in the next few weeks in winter, that is of weather. We've mentioned it several times so far in our discussion here, that weather has been relatively mild, and this has tapered demand especially in October and November 2022. And this may be about to change, as we can see from the chart here, which shows the weather forecast for this week and the next for most European countries. And in this chart, the darker the blue, the colder the temperature compared to seasonal averages. And we can see that at present we can expect colder temperatures in Eastern Europe and in the UK. And overall, this is showing the uncertainty of the evolution of weather and the impact of weather on the situation of the gas market in Europe. and the fact that rapid variations such as potentially cold snaps in a few countries or across Europe as a whole will have very important driver in shaping, will be a very important driver in shaping the evolution, especially through winter. And monitoring the evolution of weather will be very important because the European market is so tightly balanced at the moment that even small variations will play a very important role. If we go on to the next slide, we can then look at what we've mentioned before as being the main route that Europe has taken to replace Russian supply, and that is additional LNG supply. And we can see here another visualization in this chart how much European LNG imports have grown. And this has been made possible in 2022 through a reduction in demand, mainly in China and in Latin America. In China, this has come via reduced economic growth, partly driven by the stringent COVID lockdowns, and also the maximization of other supply routes such as domestic production and imports from Russia. And in Latin America, because of the higher availability of hydroelectric generation. And also Europe has absorbed most of the global supply increments in 2022. Now, the question remains, can Europe import even more LNG in 2023? And this will, where this will be possible in order to continue filling the growing supply gap will be dependent on multiple factors. There isn't a lot of new LNG supply coming into the market in 2023, and therefore Europe may have to continue relying on demand reductions from other regions. It remains uncertain whether Chinese LNG demand will rebound or not, and this will depend from the political push to continue gas demand growth and the economic outlook for China. A lot of other smaller Asian markets have probably reduced demand as much as possible by switching to other fuels, and Japan and South Korea will probably continue to be willing to pay higher prices to secure supply of LNG. So it is uncertain how much more LNG, especially in 2023, can come to Europe, and the dynamic of prices with global LNG demand will be very important in shaping the size of the supply gap in Europe. It may also be possible that the availability of LNG may be reduced in 2023 compared to 2022. Even this is somewhat less likely, but a significantly colder winter in Asia, pushing demand up in China, Japan, and South Korea, for example, may for a few weeks make the competition for global LNG much higher, push prices higher, and potentially make it somewhat more challenging for Europe to continue securing the very high rates of LNG imports. Therefore, there are a lot of global dynamics that will play a role in shaping the availability of additional supply of supply to replace Russian flows to Europe. If we go to the next slide, then we can look at the pattern for demand, and we can see here how big of a role, again, demand destruction has played in 2022 to make up the supply gap compared to 2021, with every month in Europe having lower demand overall than 2021. And we can see, especially in the first half of 2022, the role that fuel switching has played as we entered very, very high prices, a sustained period of very high prices in reducing demand. And then in October and November this year, the role of relatively mild temperatures in reducing demand. As we move on then to 2023, as we said earlier, the question remains, what will be the impact on weather, on demand, and could we see months of increased demand and even higher than 2021 potentially because of especially colder weather? Or could we see a response from policymakers in capping prices and sustaining demand from certain sectors and limiting the impact of price-driven demand destruction, potentially supporting demand and sustaining and making wider that supply gap we've discussed earlier? Or on the other hand, is there more price-driven demand destruction that can come into play? Is there even more demand destruction that can help in mitigating the growing supply gap in 2023? And the exact interplay in these dynamics will play a very important role in shaping how big the overall gap is and the evolution of prices. Now, we've looked at these quite complex and interplaying dynamics that will shape the supply-demand balance in 2023. And I think that what is safe to say is that we expect the market overall over this winter and then moving into the next winter to remain very volatile, and all of these dynamics will keep evolving, influenced by one another very rapidly, and therefore monitoring exactly the complex interplay between these dynamics will be very important in understanding risks and potential scenarios for how the crisis will evolve. I'll now pass on to Pete, who will talk us through the long-term implications of the evolution of the next year.
Thank you, Giovanni. Yeah, I'll spend a few minutes talking both about the long-term implications, what it might mean for the European market, but also global markets, as well as making a few concluding comments before we get into the Q&A. So if you could flip to the next slide, please. I think the first thing to think about in terms of long-term impacts is Europe itself, and what does the future of the European gas market look like as a consequence of the Russian crisis. I think the first and obvious thing to say is less gas but more LNG. You know, demand has already dropped. Acceleration of decarbonisation policies and investments probably means that gas is on a downward trajectory in Europe. But the role of LNG within that is increasing, or has increased, and is going to stay at a higher level. I think two implications of that in terms of both the way in which gas is consumed in Europe and the way in which that gas is supplied creates the risk of increased volatility in Europe. So on the one hand, you've got a wholesale market which is more reliant on LNG more likely to be at the margin, and with less of a moderating impact on price that Russian gas supply has historically had, means that European wholesale gas pricing is more exposed to global LNG supply demand dynamics, and therefore probably more volatile. And secondly, the role that gas plays as greater decarbonisation occurs, especially in power, and the role of gas evolves from baseload to more on the margin from a supply point of view for power. The risk is that you have a kind of doubling down of volatility, and that whilst we might expect the overall cost of supply to gas for gas to Europe to revert to something related to cost of production, marginal cost of LNG supply, for example, over the long term, in short-term cycles, we would expect that there might be more volatility of price, and that creates a whole host of risks and challenges for large energy consumers, for government and policymakers and regulators, as well as consumers and the economies themselves. Secondly, from a global perspective, there is an interesting consideration at the moment, which is the degree to which short-term effects will have a long-term impact on the trajectories of growth for gas and LNG more globally. As Farah and Giovanni already mentioned, the markets which have flexed down to enable Europe to import more LNG have predominantly been those in Asia, especially China, but also some of the South Asian markets like India, Pakistan and Bangladesh. And I think there's two questions that emerge from that. One is, does a period of sustained high spot pricing that we are in now, and we would probably expect to see to continue for the next 3 or 4 years, does that period cause a deceleration of the role of gas in some of those markets where gas is seen as an opportunity to replace coal? Increased gas consumption is part of energy transition pathways for many of those economies, and in a relatively high price market, does it A, stop the gas and LNG being delivered in the short term, which so far it has for certain markets, and secondly, does it create a different basis for investment decisions going forward, which is a more existential question, which is basically, does the role of gas in Asian markets, which has underpinned growth trajectories for gas and global LNG in everybody's version of that for the last few years, does that get challenged now? Are alternatives looked at? Is renewable programs accelerated? Does the role of coal sustain for longer, for example? So I think it creates both a a different story within Europe in terms of the role of LNG, but potentially also globally for the role of gas and the role of LNG. And over the next few years, or the next couple of years, I think observing how new project developments are brought forward, supply project developments are brought forward, and the way in which contracting of those volumes happens is going to be an indicator of where the future may lie. If I could move to the final slide, I'll maybe just make a few concluding comments and then hand to Mark to facilitate the Q&A. So if you do have questions you want to ask, please get them into the chat, and then we'll work from there. A few concluding comments. As I said, I think the main thing that we would want you to leave with here in terms of a message is that Europe is well stocked for gas in storage at the moment. The last 6 to 9 months has been quite a benevolent market environment, with Chinese economic downturn making a lot more LNG available than might otherwise have been available. And up until very recently, fairly warm weather, meaning that demand has been reduced, not only because of the economic factors that has perhaps seen some more structural demand destruction, but also more typical seasonal factors, which is that people haven't turned their heating on as much because the weather hasn't been so cold. It's left us in a position where you might think we're in reasonably good health, but the next 12 to 18 months are probably the most challenging. And again, as Farah pointed out in the first part of the presentation, there's a volumetric gap to be met just to get back to where we have been in 2022, when you consider a sustained, much lower Russian pipeline supply volume that we're currently seeing. And as we come out of this winter, so the weather this winter, and as a consequence, the demand for gas and the role of storage, as we come out of this winter, based on those storage levels and based on what we know about the build out of new import capacity, regas import capacity into Europe, we'll start to have an emerging picture of what the next winter might look like. Volatility is the word. I think we are, as a market, the European market is very finely tuned to a few big levers of change. Weather is one, availability of global LNG, or the supply-demand balance of global LNG, is another, and to a lesser extent, but still significantly, whether further curtailment of Russian gas might come. So in the shorter term, volatility is here to stay, and as I mentioned in the last slide, longer term, the emergent European gas market post 2026 is going to be different than the one that we have been used to in terms of how supply comes in and the role of gas within the market, which we think is also likely to be a driver towards more volatility. Uncertainty as well. The levers available to European governments and players are few, and demand is the biggest one. Once you accept that supply, supply will come as and when it's available, and as and when global dynamics affect it, demand management remains the last tool in the box for Europe to think about. And so we don't think we are completely beyond the risk of that having to happen, or happening more organically, further demand reduction that we've seen so far. And as we go through this dynamic, volatile period of time, as we work towards the kind of 3-4 year time horizon when significant new global LNG supply is likely to be available, when significant new regasification capacity in Europe is likely to have been built, and when some of the gas demand reduction measures, such as acceleration of decarbonisation policies, have started to bite and create an impact in Europe. In that period of time, we're going to remain in this quite tightly wound, dynamic, volatile market. And so tracking and monitoring some of those drivers and some of those dynamics, supply, demand, infrastructure, becomes really important. Thanks, Mark.
Fantastic. Brilliant. Thanks so much, Pete, Farah and Giovanni, for setting out the situation and outlook there very clearly. We're going to move on to the Q&A then in a second. So a few questions appearing in the chat, which is fantastic. Do drop further questions in there, and we will try and work through as many of those as we can. I think it seems to me that we're in more or less the best position going into the depths of this winter that we could have imagined maybe a few months ago. Gas storage pretty full in Europe, and we've had this very mild start to the winter. I think you've all given a sort of stark reminder there, though, of some of the challenges to come. And we're only just getting into the depths of this winter. And of course, around refilling of storage next summer and how we go into the winter to come. I think, Pete, and maybe an initial question from me is, you touched on this in the conclusions, whether there are particular metrics or leading indicators that we should be monitoring over the coming months to give almost an early warning of potential risks or issues as we go along. Giovanni mentioned gas storage levels as maybe one metric, but are there others that we should be looking at?
Yeah, there are, and I'll give an overview and invite Giovanni to add any detail that I have missed out. But I think, in very simple terms, it's supply, demand, and infrastructure. But what that really means is demand in particular markets, and that's demand relative to flexibility that they may have for alternatives. And I think our hypothesis is that much of that flexibility has already been exercised. You know, if things could be switched, they probably already have been. So there's tracking and understanding demand, which is clearly linked to weather in particular markets. There's supply, and that's both local supply, so production levels, pipeline import levels, and LNG import levels. And LNG import levels is linked to the availability of LNG supply globally. So that also takes you to monitoring supply availability of key LNG producers, or all LNG producers, and competing demand, where other markets where there may be competing demand, which at least has an impact on price and maybe has an impact on volume availability. And then infrastructure, which is interconnecting infrastructure. You know, a real challenge in Europe in this world versus the world that it's come from is transmission networks in Europe were not designed to move volumes of gas north to south, west to east, that they might be required to in this new world, given that much supply historically, of course, has come east to west. And then import infrastructure, and especially in the shorter term, the rate of build out of European regas capacity. You know, we've previous webinars we've seen how regas capacity in sort of non-Iberia continental Europe has been very close to maximum for the last few months. And the ability to import this additional LNG, which is likely in 2023, is obviously also dependent on the ability to get those facilities online. Over the medium term, there's so many projects coming, so many regas projects coming, that eases off. But in the immediate term, that piece of infrastructure is also relevant. And the metric in the middle of all this, of course, is storage levels, and monitoring where they are and how we're coming out of the winter gives us a fairly a good basis to understand what the next year might look like, or where that risk is going to reside and what the sensitivity to that risk is. I don't know, Giovanni, if there's anything you would add to that.
Maybe I'll just briefly add that as we have LNG playing such an important role in supporting Europe in make up that supply gap, really taking a look at the global dynamics, and because LNG is a global market, taking a look at dynamics not just in Europe but in the global market, supply disruptions and the evolution of demand, weather, for example, in East Asia, and the global economic conditions and the ability of global buyers to continue buying LNG at the current prices will also be very important. This is one of the things that makes really tracking all of these complex and interconnected leading indicators quite so challenging.
Brilliant. Thanks, Giovanni. Thanks, Pete. So I will attempt to sort of thematically group these questions, but it might be a bit of a random walk. I think you kind of touched there on the importance of sort of competing demand for gas globally. And we've got a good question here around whether we've got a view of what Northeast Asian demand is likely to do next year, sort of around Japan, Korea, perhaps trying to reduce exposure to LNG imports, big uncertainty around China. Any views on that?
Maybe I'll have a first go at that, and again I'll invite Farah and Giovanni to add anything if they have anything. I think the way that Yano has articulated it there is about right, that Japan and Korea are trying to minimize their LNG imports, largely because they don't want to pay very high prices for spot LNG. So where there are alternative means of power or energy, they're using them to the extent that they can. There remains quite a lot of Japanese nuclear capacity offline, so there's a question about how that might come back, and that might further ease pressure on LNG. And then China is the big question, and Chinese demand this year has been down to a large extent because of the reduced economic activity as a result of the zero COVID policy. So one of the big questions is when and how might that policy change? I was at a conference in Singapore only 2 weeks ago, and the view was it's not going to change for a while. They've got to kind of try and contain COVID, and they're going to keep doing it. And of course, the news that I read this morning is that actually they're now starting to lessen and loosen the zero COVID policy. So even in the context of that, the volatility and the uncertainty is still quite high. I think if you do see a kick up of Chinese demand, that does become a pressure point. That does increase global pressure on supply. And I said it a minute ago, at the least it's probably a price effect where you get some competing bidding, and at worst it becomes a supply unavailability in certain periods. It's also true that lots of Chinese LNG into China is on long-term contracts. A lot of the volumes that came to Europe because the Chinese buyers said we'll divert them to Europe. Well, if they say we're not going to divert them to Europe anymore because we need to take them home, that's what they'll do. So this is not just about competing at the spot price. This is from a Chinese buyer point of view. Do I optimize my cargo and sell it for a higher value into Europe, or do I keep it and bring it into China? Well, if they've got demand and they need to meet their demand at home, that's probably what they're going to do. So the control of those volumes and how those volumes might move is also quite important.
Brilliant. Thanks, Pete. I think actually a really interesting related question here around whether we've got any visibility on where Russia's up to on being able to export gas to other markets. So substituting the reduced delivery into Europe by exporting more gas to China or other Asian markets, for example. Do we have visibility on where they're up to on that, the sort of timing? Are they building new pipelines, new LNG export capacity? Yeah, any views on that?
Do you want to go?
So I would say, I'll go. So I would say that probably this is not a quick fix, and Russia is also suffering the pain of reduced exports at the moment, and there isn't an easy way to immediately shift to other markets such as China, and this will take time. There are of course plans that are being developed at the moment, and these are being accelerated to do just that, but I think it is very uncertain exactly the extent to which that will be possible. And also it is very uncertain at the moment, and it's very important to remember that Russia had big plans to expand its LNG export capacity, especially targeting Asia, but it is uncertain how much and how quickly it will be able to do that because of limitations in the access to international financing and technology to develop this LNG export infrastructure. So overall, I think that it is not going to be an immediate and quick fix, and Russia will also be suffering a material pain from the reduced exports to Europe. It's very important to remember that.
Yeah, at its heart, it's not the same gas. The gas that's exported to Europe isn't connected to the gas that you would export to China or via LNG. So as well as export infrastructure, you need some significant internal infrastructure to move that gas within the country. And if you think about pipeline to China, which would be a possibility, increased pipeline gas to China, your growth is market led. You know, it's one of the challenges with pipeline supplies is your growth of supply is linked to the way in which the market needs more gas, and that's not usually a big step up. That's usually a gradual increase. So I think, yeah, exactly as Giovanni said, it's not a quick fix. If and when Russia is able to pivot some of its gas that otherwise might have come to Europe to another market, it's 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years away probably.
I just add that also relates to China's policy, longer term policy of coal gas switch to coal to gas switch, or coal directly to renewables, and how far it will go in terms of shaping their demand.
Brilliant. We've got a couple of related questions here on really the sensitivity of demand to price. And I guess, first of all, do we have views on at what price we might see demand recovery or some upward trend in demand, either in Europe or in Asia? And it's a related question whether we think there is any scope for further demand reduction over the coming year or so, or actually has all that been crystallized already, given the very high prices we've already seen? Maybe if we kind of take that pair first, and then actually there's a related question as a follow-on to that. But yeah, I don't know who fancies taking those questions first.
I can have a start, and maybe Peter and Farah can fill in later. But I would say that, first of all, as we have seen over the last few months, when there has been a letdown in prices and prices have somewhat been fallen, there has been some response in demand, even if prices remain very, very high compared to previous expectations. So we can expect some return of demand, even if prices only partially fall from current levels, because the market is so tight and demand has been minimized in all possible available spaces, and overall there is still demand for the end products that require gas, especially in markets that rely very, very heavily on gas and energy imports. I'm thinking, for example, markets as India. So there will be a demand response, whatever price reduction there is in the market, and we've seen that happening over the last few months. Overall, I would say that probably when we're looking at next year, there may be some scope for further price-driven demand reduction, but that is probably a lot less than what we've seen previously, and we've already exhausted almost, if not all, of the scope to reduce demand in response to prices, especially from more price-sensitive markets globally. There may be still some industrial activity in Europe that can be curtailed, but I would say that probably we've already exhausted the most of that capacity.
Brilliant. Thanks, Giovanni. A sort of related question, I think, around maybe more structural shifts in gas demand, and whether we expect any shift in technology away from gas in some applications like residential heating, industrial energy consumption. Any views on that?
Yeah. I mean, that is the heart of REPowerEU as a policy direction for European markets. You know, the crisis at a very high level, the EU and most member state governments have there's kind of two things: is in the short term, how do we get volume in, because we've lost a huge amount of volume, we need more gas. So that's about enabling more LNG, basically, because that's the source. So lots of regas projects, lots of talk about contracting for more volumes. You're starting to see some European buyers bringing volumes in, and government even getting involved in some of that. The other one then is, how do we reduce our reliance on imported natural gas, which Europe will forever be reliant on imported natural gas given the state of its domestic production, as quickly as possible. So accelerating renewables build out, accelerating hydrogen, accelerating almost everything that sort of takes gas out of the mix. But that is easier said than done in lots of cases. I think the renewables acceleration is more achievable because oftentimes in Mark, you know this way better than me, but oftentimes it's about permitting and how quickly we can bring projects through. And if governments can unstick that process, you can probably accelerate the rate at which you build renewable energy. But taking gas out of heat, out of homes and industry is much more challenging and much more difficult, either because you've got to do a electrification of home heating, heat pumps or something, which is a major infrastructure investment. It's costly. It doesn't work for all kinds of housing. It's everywhere. You know, it's a massive program. Or hydrogen. Well, hydrogen we know will take time to build up to a critical mass. Will also require some infrastructure investment. So I think there are bits of the gas demand mix which are going to be much slower to reduce, but the plan, I think, at the high level is to do as much as can be done as quickly as possible, accelerate transition out, which creates this paradoxical situation commercially for gas supply, natural gas and LNG supply into Europe, which is we want lots of gas and LNG now, but we don't know how long we want to have it for, and we kind of want to stop buying it as quickly as possible, which is not a great message for a supplier when you're trying to cut a deal. Yes,
and that exactly links to another question here that I think is a really key point, which is, are we kind of walking into a situation where we may have an oversupply of gas in, second half of the 2020s? All of the measures and the strong reactions, totally understandable what is happening now, but actually, is there quite a lot of downside risk on price and a risk of that oversupply situation? Kind of views on that.
I think that's an incredibly interesting question, and that's something that we've been thinking about a lot recently, because I don't think it is necessarily the most likely situation, but it is a concrete possibility that we enter the second half of the 2020s with an oversupplied market. You can imagine a situation in which there has been multiple years of reduced economic growth or even recession in most of the developed economies, and therefore that overall global demand growth that you would have expected otherwise, especially from the developing markets in Asia and Southeast Asia, has not materialized or has been much lower. And therefore, as Europe progressively tries to reduce its dependency, as we just discussed, from gas imports, and a lot more supply enters the market in response of what has just happened, and a lot of that supply may enter the market in an almost speculative manner to try and catch the current supply crisis before it goes away. Then we can see a picture where we have multiple years of very low prices and an overall globally oversupplied market. If all of these factors align, then we kind of have a perfect storm of excessive buildup of supply and reduced demand.
It's worth thinking about what that really means for Europe, though, because actually what that means is an abundant supply of low-cost natural gas. So actually, it doesn't mean we'll have volumes and we won't know what to do with them. It won't, because of the way gas has flowed into Europe thus far, unless suddenly there's a whole slew of long-term contracts signed to secure supply into Europe. Europe is always a flexible market where spot cargoes and short-term flexible cargoes come and go. The price is very low. The price gets low. It's helpful for the economy. It creates some interesting dynamics in that policy driver to decarbonize, because suddenly gas is very affordable, and that creates an interesting dimension. But actually, Europe's sort of exposure to that market is a risk. The bigger risk is to the suppliers ultimately, who find themselves, the global market's depressed and they can't make a profit on their LNG globally.
Fabulous, great. There are a couple of questions we haven't got to, but I am going to call time. at that point. Just before I wrap up, any closing remarks from your side, Pete, as we kind of end things?
Yeah, one thing I guess I'd like to say to the people who are listening into this, thank you for doing that. The work you've seen us present today, this way of trying to understand and track at quite a granular and data-led way how the European market is going to evolve over the next 18 months to 2 years through what we think is the highest risk period in terms of security of supply for gas and consequentially power potentially. This is something that we've developed as a tool, as a service that we can make available to clients. We would be very happy if you wanted to learn more about that and how we can provide this kind of data-led view of security of supply on a continuous basis. Please reach out. The contact details for any four of us should be available, and we'd be very happy to talk to you about that.
Fabulous. Thanks then, Pete. Thanks to all our speakers today. Thank you all for joining the session and for the engagement and some great questions at the end there. Can I just draw your attention to the next couple of webinars that are coming up in our series, and Jen might pop on screen here what those are. So first of all, we have next week a very closely related session on the legacy of the invasion of Ukraine from a power and energy market perspective. So we've got a great session on the 14th of December, pre-Christmas, running through that. And then we'll have a follow-up early in the new year on the REMA session that we had last week. So GB market reform and how that might apply to flexible assets in particular and flexibility markets. So that coming up early in the new year. So with that, thank you very much again for joining. Do reach out to any of the experts if you want to follow up on any points or any further questions. And we look forward to seeing you in a future session. Thanks, everyone.